Amid the madness unfolding in the Middle East, the Trump administration has now kickstarted military operations in its so-called backyard. On the 3rd of March, in a joint US-Ecuadorian attack, a command and training center belonging to a dissident drug trafficking group from Colombia's FARC was destroyed. Helicopters, aircraft, riverboats, and drones were all used to locate and bomb the site, located near the border between Ecuador and Colombia. Ecuador is now a petri dish for the Trump administration's scaled-up interventions in the Western Hemisphere, a new front in Trump's offensive on the Latin American criminal groups, which raises a few questions. Why Ecuador specifically? What exactly has been happening there over the past few years? Is this the start of something much bigger? And how does this fit into the broader shakeup of the global stage? Most of you will already know about the state of the cartel scene in Mexico and Trump's offers to send in the US military to fight the cartels. Mexico's president, Claudia Sheinbaum, is dead against this, but Trump seems to be quite set on using force to tackle the cartels for good. Case in point, US pressure to take down El Mencho last month, and it was CIA intel that led to the decisive raid. But Ecuador is now facing one of the worst security crises in its history. Its homegrown gangs have been around for decades, but in recent years they've been growing far more powerful, far more organized, and like in Mexico, they're now taking the state head on. So, how did this happen? Well, a big part of it is geography, or perhaps geonarcotics. Ecuador is wedged in between the world's two largest producers of cocaine, Peru and Colombia. It's also got a nice stretch of Pacific coastline and some very developed port infrastructure, especially the port of Guayaquil, one of the most important in South America. So, during the 90s, the cocaine trade explodes. NAFTA comes into force, cross-border trade is at a record high, and that means the US-Mexico border is especially porous. Thousands of trucks every day. It's a no-brainer for traffickers. Shipments are like needles in haystacks. The Mexican cartels are also running well-oiled machines, and the Colombians are there to meet the supply. Now, Ecuador starts getting roped in. Why? Well, again, it's got all this developed port infrastructure, and it's a huge regional exporter. To name just one product, Ecuador was, and remains to this day, the world's largest exporter of bananas. But then you also have shrimp, coffee, flowers, and more. That means huge volumes of shipping containers moving through the ports every day. And again, this is a smuggler's dream. So what you get is both independent traffickers, but also groups like FARC who use Ecuador as a transit point to smuggle cocaine. So 90s and 2000s, Ecuador is mainly a transit point. But that's soon going to change pretty sharpish as the trade expands, counter-narcotics evolve in the region, and local Ecuadorian gangs move in to claim a bigger slice of the pie. The most important gang to emerge during this period is a group called Los Choneros, as in the people from the city of Chone, in the coastal province of Manabí. And though that's where they get their start, in reality, their main base of operations soon becomes Manta. The Choneros start out in the 90s as a band of petty criminals involved in things like car theft, extortion, and contract killings. But then they link up with this big Ecuadorian trafficker and they get involved with the transportation and protection of his cocaine shipments bound for the big ports like Guayaquil. Basically, they're providing logistics and muscle. This gang will go on to become central in the evolution of Ecuador's criminal underworld. So, besides geonarcotics and Ecuador's role as an export economy, a few factors and conditions are really going to help the gang, but Ecuadorian crime more generally along the way. 1. Weak, underfunded institutions. That means weak law and order, and the gang can thrive with relative impunity. 2. Corruption. As the gang gets richer and more powerful, it becomes more effective at corrupting the right people. So politicians, judges, port officials, police officers, Official corruption's already a big thing in Ecuador, think Odebrecht-style scandals, but now we're talking cocaine money, and the real threat of violence, if ever the carrot, isn't enough. 3. Ecuador uses the US dollar, has done since 2000. That means the US dollars that traffickers are raking in from US street sales can flow straight into Ecuadorian front businesses without needing to be converted into local currency. Much harder to do this in a country like Colombia, for instance. 4. Developing economy. Lots of poverty in Ecuador. Lots of economic desperation. That makes gang recruitment much easier as kids and young adults are lured by criminal profits and a support network. 5. Limited counter-narcotics. One of the go-to turning points cited by analysts is 2009. Basically, the new leftist president, who's pretty iffy about American presence in Ecuador, he kicks out US military personnel from an airbase they'd been using for about a decade in the coastal city of Manta. It had been supporting reconnaissance flights across the Pacific. Pretty effective, we're told, at keeping the pressure on smuggling operations. So losing that facilitated the unhindered growth of these trafficking operations. Then, a decade later, a different president reorganizes Ecuador's secret services based on pretty good evidence the leftist president had been spying on and harassing rivals, suspected and real. This means the various security agencies are not well aligned at all, and counter-narcotics is hindered. So all this to say, throughout the 2010s, the Choneros start becoming really quite powerful. They're now much more embedded in the domestic cocaine scene. They've expanded to other coastal areas, and they're providing storage, logistics, and port access to both Colombian and Mexican groups, particularly the Sinaloa cartel. This is worth remembering. The Choneros are early allies of the Sinaloa cartel, and they make them flood foreign markets, especially Europe, with cocaine. The imprisoned leaders of Los Choneros, they're commanding operations out of Ecuador's major prisons. You get this whole criminal ecosystem developing where gangs club together in cell blocks to control turf. Ownership of a cell block is essentially like owning territory out on the streets. It's a source of power and it's a source of revenue as it's an operations command center. Corruption is therefore rife as gang members pay for cells and privileges while facing off with other gangs for control. Then, by the turn of the new decade, something happens that changes the criminal underworld forever. In December 2020, this guy gets shot, just days after getting out of jail. His name was Jorge Luis Zambrano, nickname Arasquinha, meaning itch or urge. He was very clever and he was completely ruthless. He'd been instrumental in the rise to power of Los Choneros, taking out major rivals in the local drug scene to consolidate power. He was also a boss of bosses. What he'd done was ally with other gangs while inside a prison and told them, look, the Choneros have great resources, great contacts, join us and you'll be stronger and wealthier. You can keep your organizations intact, pretty much keep your independence, just report under me. It worked, and the gangs respected him immensely for it. Because of him, the Choneros ballooned in size as they absorbed all these different gangs, and they turned Los Choneros into this federation of mercenaries, essentially at the bidding of major international crime bosses. Now, when Arasquinha goes, basically everything goes to shit. The whole structure depended on his authority and charisma, so splinter factions start blaming each other for the assassination. You see coalition building, and you start seeing brutal gang murders, especially in the prisons. In February 2021, for example, you get an absolute bloodbath with simultaneous attacks against Los Choneros by 4 rival gangs across 3 prisons. At least 79 inmates are killed by guns, machetes, and explosives. It only gets worse. Between 2021 and 2022, you get over 400 inmate deaths, Compare that with just 19 in the first half of 2019. The most important rivalry to come out of this is Los Choneros, or the Old Loyalists, versus Los Lobos, aka the Wolves, one of the splinter factions that emerged after Arasquinha's assassination. Violence spills out onto the streets as the gangs vie for turf and smuggling routes. The CJNG, Mexico's Jalisco New Generation Cartel, they see an opportunity to undermine their national rivals, the Sinaloa Cartel, who you'll remember are backing Los Choneros. So the CJNG teams up with Los Lobos. You now get this gang proxy war between the two Mexican heavyweights, Sinaloa and Jalisco New Generation, both trying to dominate the Ecuadorian smuggling scene and therefore both fueling the violence. Both sides send guns, materiel, manpower, financial resources, training, etc. So the violence explodes. Guayaquil, with its port, river routes, and infrastructure, is the epicenter of the violence. Brutal killings become much more common. Bodies are left in public places or hung from bridges as warnings to rivals, tactics familiar from Mexico's cartel wars. Whereas the national homicide rate in Ecuador in 2018 was around 6 homicides per 100,000 people, by 2023 it stood at 44.5. An increase of nearly 650%. There were two major incidents in the escalation of the violence which highlighted just how serious the security crisis had become. One was the scandalous assassination of presidential candidate Fernando Villavicencio in August of 2023. Just before his murder, he had publicly denounced collusion between drug traffickers and state officials. Villavicencio's death played a huge role in the election of Daniel Noboa just 2 months later. Noboa is a political outsider from a billionaire family with major holdings in the banana export trade. And he's running on a campaign vowing to crack down on the gangs and restore law and order. Which brings us to the second major incident on the 9th of January 2024, when Ecuadorian gang members stormed a TV station in Guayaquil during a live broadcast. This was absolutely shocking. Bear in mind that just 1 day earlier, Noboa had declared a state of national emergency after the prison escape of a major Chonero kingpin, along with a 60-day curfew for the military to recapture him. The prison escape had led to fierce gang riots across multiple prisons, as well as the kidnappings of around 150 guards and staff. So imagine you're an Ecuadorian amidst all the chaos, a national emergency has just been declared, and you see masked gunmen storming the studio of one of the country's most renowned news agencies. It is pure terrorism. Let me emphasize now that while these two incidents are especially key in the historical timeline, the murders of multiple prosecutors, mayors, mayoral candidates between 2022 and 2024, as well as gang attacks on the state, had clearly outlined the serious deterioration of national security and the growing boldness of these gangs. This was a piecemeal thing. The very same day of the TV incident, Noboa declares a state of, quote, internal armed conflict. 22 gangs are designated as terrorist organizations, and the military gets the green light to now play a direct role in domestic law enforcement and take out the gangs. So the military gets sent into Ecuador's criminal hotspots, especially around the major coastal cities like Guayaquil and Duran. Now, for many Ecuadorians, armed soldiers, checkpoints and patrols quickly become routine sights, and the military teams up with the police to carry out raids. Initially, the crackdown appeared to work. There was a sharp decline in violence, which actually helped Noboa get re-elected. But then that reversed. The first half of 2025 was brutal. By the end of the year, Ecuador had recorded the highest murder rate in its nation's history. 50 homicides for every 100,000 people. That was the highest in Latin America. We start seeing more of these gangs vying for turf, which leads to brutal killings and massacres. The splinter factions from the Choneros, they splinter again, which leads to more division. Just as Felipe Calderón's war against Mexico's cartels proved disastrous in many ways, the Ecuadorian clampdown has also been catastrophic, as many analysts had predicted. And there are other problems as well with the military's offensive. Major human rights abuses. The military has taken over the prisons, and yet deaths inside have skyrocketed. Not from gang violence, but actually from malnutrition, disease, and neglect. I mean, we're seeing huge breakouts of tuberculosis. In 2025 alone, we're told at least 600 inmates died from health and nutrition-related issues, and those were just from one prison, La Litoral Penitentiary, just outside Guayaquil. We're also getting widespread allegations of torture and forced disappearances, including of children. Critics of the Noboa government are actually sounding alarm bells, warning of a clear slide towards authoritarianism. Not many people outside of Ecuador are talking about this. We're seeing real suppression of any kind of dissent, whether that's protesters or the political opposition. The independence of the judiciary has also massively come under attack. Many Ecuadorians are concerned with how this president has taken this initially quite popular war on the gangs to consolidate power and silence any real form of opposition. Meanwhile, the flow of drugs doesn't really seem to have been affected much. An estimated 70% of the world's cocaine supply still flows through Ecuador. That alone highlights the seriousness of Ecuador's predicament. Traffickers have just adapted. For instance, the military has set up scanners for the major port entries and are also carrying out patrols around the key port areas. Traffickers have just bypassed these by loading up the shipping containers before they even reach the port, or by linking up with the ships out on the open sea. Another tactic has just been to use smaller, non-commercial ports and coercing local fisherfolk to do their bidding under threat of death. While the violence is carried on pretty much unabated, Noboa has been cozying up with the Trump administration for deeper security ties, and he's found a very receptive partner. Trump has been very vocal about the need to crush Latin American criminal organizations by using the US military for presenting both a national security and a public health threat, particularly because of drugs like fentanyl. Interestingly, following in Noboa's footsteps, in 2025, the Trump administration starts formally designating several Latin American criminal groups as terrorist organizations, a label which is later extended to Ecuadorian gangs like the Choneros and the Lobos under pressure from Noboa. What the designation does is it dramatically expands the legal tools available to the US government, including the possibility of military operations against these groups. So we see this as a government pretext to arrest and extract the former president of Venezuela, Nicolás Maduro, that great kingpin of the world-famous Cartel de los Soles. This all fits into what even the Trump administration itself is calling the Donro Doctrine. As some of you will know, the name riffs on the Monroe Doctrine, a 19th century US foreign policy which basically aimed to keep European colonial powers out of the Western Hemisphere. It kind of morphed into an excuse to meddle in Latin America when US political and business interests were threatened, but that's another story. Trump's spin on it is adapted to the new global order. The goal is a stable Western Hemisphere filled with pro-American governments who can keep Russia and particularly China out of the US's backyard. China is especially concerning as over the last couple of decades, they've seriously ramped up their economic presence across the region through trade, investment, mega project tenders, and infrastructural financing. For many Latin American countries, China is actually a larger trading partner than the US. Of course, organized crime is also a genuine security threat. The Mexican cartels in particular have a presence in almost every US state. In 2023, fentanyl overdoses alone killed over 76,000 Americans. That represents the most severe drug crisis in US history. And we're only talking about fentanyl. Add to that the wave of insurgency-style wars against the state while plaguing the region with predatory crime, death, and terror. Latin America's criminal groups are destabilizing the countries they operate in. So, Washington has been pushing a broader security alignment it's calling the Shield of Americas. It was unveiled at an Inter-American summit of that name on the 7th of March. That means US and US-friendly regimes, most on the political right, banding together for closer military and intelligence alignment in the fight against organized crime. US skeptic governments like Lula's Brazil and Sheinbaum's Mexico were conspicuously not invited to the party. Ecuador's Noboa, though, has been one of Trump's keenest allies. He was there for Trump's inauguration. Trump's closest advisors have been to Ecuador on multiple state visits, and there's even been close alignment on establishing a US military base in the region, an idea that's recently been shut down by Ecuadorian voters in a national referendum. Noboa's courting of the Trump administration hasn't all been about the pomp, though. Some of you might remember Trump's public spat with the Colombian president, Gustavo Petro, earlier in January, something which put the Americas even more on edge with the possibility of another Maduro-style extraction in Colombia. Well, it turns out Noboa isn't happy with Petro either. He blames him for not pulling his weight in stopping the avalanche of cocaine pouring into Ecuador from Colombia. So he pulls a Trump and slaps Colombia with 30% tariffs on goods, recently brought up to 50%. The trade war is ongoing. And then there's Cuba. The Trump administration is actively trying to force regime change in Cuba by strangling its economy, cutting off oil and money supplies from its key ally, Venezuela. Earlier this month, Noboa declared Cuban ambassadors personae non gratae and gave the Cuban diplomatic mission in Quito 48 hours to leave the country. He stated that they'd been involved in political meddling. Well, to start with, in case it wasn't clear enough, and I need to stress this because there'll be a lot of people underplaying this, there is a genuine security crisis in Ecuador, one that's exploded very quickly in just a matter of years and which the Trump administration clearly believes requires immediate attention. Recent successes have probably emboldened Washington as well. There was the, frankly, superbly executed shock and awe Venezuelan raid to kick 2026 off with a bang. Then there was the takeout of the CJNG kingpin El Mencho, brought on by US pressure and CIA intelligence, though it was ultimately Mexican special ops who took him down. You almost get the impression that Trump's team has been itching to escalate the fight against the gangs, and those early operations have now created the momentum to push further. What we're seeing looks increasingly like the rollout of a broader hemispheric offensive against organized crime. The strike on the FARC command post can be seen as one of the first, if not the first moves in this new hawkish and inter-American phase in the war on drugs. In other words, this isn't just about Ecuador. From the US perspective, in many ways, Ecuador makes for a convenient testing ground. Arguably, intervention would have a sound moral basis in the eyes of US voters. Ecuador's facing an explosion of gang crime and the worst homicide rate per capita in the world. In the long shadow of the Mexican cartel wars, Ecuadorian civilians are being pulled into the gang's orbit. The groups aren't just involved in trafficking or illegal mining in the case of Los Lobos, they're also extorting legitimate businesses across swathes of the country. They're becoming more militarized, more organized, and more brazen. They're also being fueled by the very same Mexican cartels that Washington is trying to dismantle. Hitting Ecuador also hits them. At the same time, Ecuador's criminal landscape hasn't yet reached the level of entrenched power you see in places like Mexico. From Washington's perspective, that may make the country a rare opportunity, where the growth of criminal influence is more containable than, say, in Mexico, which is already much further down the road. The idea then, in theory, is to nip their growth in the bud while it's still somewhat feasible. Obviously, there are massive doubts about this. The gangs are very powerful, and there are plenty of historic precedents to make the case that military intervention simply doesn't work. Another factor that makes Ecuador safer as a petri dish is the political alignment. We're seeing a regime in Ecuador that is unusually close to Washington and has actively sought US security assistance. This is in stark contrast with Mexico's president, Claudia Sheinbaum, who has flatly rejected the idea of Trump intervening with the US military. In theory, the invitation gives Washington more political cover to get involved. But then the legal and political foundations are still pretty shaky. Trump's expanding campaign against these newly dubbed terrorist groups rests on pretty murky legal authority and lacks clear congressional approval. And Ecuadorians don't seem overly keen on deeper US intervention either. Just last November, Ecuadorian voters overwhelmingly rejected a proposal to lift the country's constitutional ban on foreign military bases. To answer the question, okay, but why is Trump attacking now? There are two final, more cynical, more speculative, but equally very plausible motivations. One, Ecuador's got oil, heavy crude oil. It's the country's most lucrative export. Well, after cocaine. And it sends it to West Coast refineries specialized in handling heavy, sour oil like Ecuador's. They refine it. Ecuador buys the petroleum at big markups. So for the US, it's not just for domestic consumption, it's also a big moneymaker. Having a stable oil partner like Ecuador in the region ahead of the looming energy crisis from the war in Iran makes sense both economically and politically. Then there's, of course, the Epstein files. Trump is facing serious accusations of complicity with a serial child rapist and sex trafficker, and the scrutiny has only been mounting. Trump's administration has dramatically escalated its foreign policy activity, as we're all seeing with the war in Iran. We can genuinely question how much the timing of this is all really a coincidence. It's taking up the media's time and attention, and it's taking up congressional time and attention. Let's see how this hemispheric shakeup plays out.